So New York City has a new plan to help people more easily find apartments, but it could mean that your next neighbor has a criminal record, or maybe even your next roommate.
Housing discrimination against people with conviction impacts hundreds of thousands of our fellow New Yorkers and their families.
The legislation would ban landlords from running criminal background checks on prospective tenants.
Those in favor of this bill say landlords have been able to legally discriminate against tenants for decades.
It's a very scary time in New York for those of us who've lived in the city our whole lives. We really want to make sure we're safe in our homes, we're safe going in and out of our homes.
You're letting someone come into your home and you don't know whether they've been in and out of prison.
These keys are going to help us understand the pros and cons of this new plan. But before we go inside an apartment to look at how these new rules could impact New York City's living conditions, it's important to understand what this new plan involves because it's very controversial.
It's called the Fair Chance for Housing Act. The legislation would ban landlords from running criminal background checks on prospective tenants, prohibiting housing discrimination and allowing formerly incarcerated New Yorkers to move in if qualified.
So this video's from a year ago, but the same legislation that's being talked about recently passed at the end of 2023 with a few modifications. And people are hopeful this will help people who are in the city's shelter system and who are homeless. The hope is that this law will help people who are in a tough spot and happen to have a criminal record get an apartment and get back on their feet. And the reason this is important is because anyone who's done time is apparently 10 times more likely than the general population to struggle with homelessness. And this is according to the New York Times. But opponents of this law say that past behavior is a good indication of someone's future behavior. And at hand here is a debate over whether or not someone's past criminal actions should stop them from getting an apartment, and whether or not giving them a place would make things dangerous in an apartment building.
Jeffrey Davis lost his brother, former New York City Council member James Davis, to violence back in 2003. He says it would bring crime into our homes.
You're letting someone come into your home and you don't know whether they've been in and out of prison.
So as you can see, some people think this might make the homes they live in now more dangerous. And landlord advocates say that being unable to check someone's criminal history and evaluate whether or not they're a good tenant based on past behavior could put the safety of other residents at risk. But tenants' rights groups and anti-homeless advocates say that a criminal background check doesn't tell you if someone's future is going to be the same as their past, and that it's not the whole story. Plus, everyone deserves a second chance. And on top of that, criminal background checks are not the only tools landlords can use to decide if someone will pay rent on time. Landlords can still check your credit. They can still ask for income and wage statements. They can even ask you for bank statements to prove your financial eligibility. Advocates say that if someone meets the same financial requirements as every other renter in a building, they should also be allowed to live there. And they shouldn't be forced to live out here on the streets. But New York City is also seeing rises in crime, like assault and robbery. And the big question is, do New Yorkers want to see the same level of safety that they see in the subway when they come home every day and enter their own apartment building? Is that what people want? So this is a 3-bedroom apartment for $3,300. Probably one of the cheapest places anywhere in the city. And even though it might not be very large, the per person rent here, we're talking $1,100 each. And even if 2 people want to live here, $1,650. That's like a studio 7 or 8 years ago. But if you take a look outside in the hallways, even though things are nice and well maintained, there's not a lot of room. If you're passing somebody either in the apartment or outside in the hallway, you're gonna be very, very close to them. Also, on each floor of this building, there are 6 apartments. That's a lot of different doors that someone could come in and out of. And because it's a relatively tight space, safety's a big deal. And landlord advocates say that, you know, if we can't check the backgrounds of people that are living in an environment like this, it could be a recipe for disaster. Because if you're in the hallway, the only way out is through the ground floor, way down there. Also, this building, the doors have locks. There are security cameras, but those can only do something after something else has already happened. And that brings up the first point against this new law. Should all crime, or rather, should all past criminal convictions be treated the same? For example, if somebody is convicted of a crime inside an apartment building, would it make sense for that type of crime to be looked at differently than, say, somebody who ran an online scam? I'm not saying that one is necessarily better or worse than the other, but one did take place in a place where people live, and landlord advocates say that property owners should be able to look at the types of crimes somebody was convicted of in the past, because that has a bearing on what could happen in an apartment building.
As it stands, the legislation would not ban landlords from the New York Sex Offender Registry, would not apply to two-family homes, and would not affect NYCHA complexes because background checks are required by federal law.
So what's interesting about this is that NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, the largest public housing group in the entire country, would have been immune from these laws in their original form. But in order to pass, the laws ended up being modified from their original form so that they now include a look-back period where landlords can consider certain crimes within a narrow time frame, just like NYCHA can. With NYCHA, certain felonies and convictions result in a 5 to 6 year waiting period if you want to get housing, and even misdemeanors can bar you from housing for 3 to 4 years. Now, applicants in public housing, they can request a hearing if they end up getting denied, and at that hearing, they can go over what went wrong, why it may have happened, and if they should still be considered for housing in spite of their record. But what's interesting is that as originally written, this law would have made it harder for people to rent government apartments than private apartments. This is so New York. You've got the old school pipes right here, and it looks like they built a little compartment so that they could fit a dishwasher under the sink. There's actually quite a few things that surprised me about this little place, but what's really surprising is that this law about criminal background checks not being allowed was amended to allow some of them for a specific period of time, which is probably a good compromise. Honestly, I did not think we were gonna see laundry in a place this affordable. But let's say you wanna rent it and you committed a crime within the last 5 years or a misdemeanor within the last 3 years, you could still technically get rejected, and that's gonna screw some folks up. But it does give people the opportunity to start rebuilding their lives at some point, when previously a landlord could run a background report for you and find something at any point and say, you know what, I don't want to give this person a chance. But check out this article by Forbes. It says that criminals who have jobs are less likely to continue being criminals. And perhaps people who thought that these laws were a good idea have applied similar logic to this to the housing scene. After all, if someone can't work, can't find a place to live, can't be a normal member of society, you could argue that it's hard to expect them to become one. But then at the end of the day, behavior does have consequences. But New York City's also got laws that prevent other types of discrimination that have been on the books for a long time. For example, landlords can't reject you for an apartment because of what you do for a living. And they also can't reject you for an apartment if you previously sued your last landlord in court, or if a prior landlord ended up suing you for not paying rent. You can't reject somebody for that. Yet many folks report that if they've been to housing court in the past, or if they maybe do something non-traditional for a living, they have problems finding an apartment, which means that discrimination might still be out there. And the big question is, why is that happening? So most property owners in New York City have similar requirements, which makes it kind of strange that some people have an easy time finding a place and other people don't. As a general rule of thumb, most landlords are gonna wanna see that you make 40 times the monthly rent as your annual income. For example, if there's a $2,000 apartment in a building like this, the owner's gonna wanna see that you make $80,000 a year in income. Owners are also gonna wanna see that you pay your bills on time, which generally means having a credit score of 650 to 700 or more. And this is where things get interesting, because even though most landlords have similar qualifications, they aren't standardized in any legal way, which means landlords are free to adjust their requirements whenever they feel like it. And what this essentially means is that you could be unqualified to live here, but you could be qualified to live in this building over here across the street. And since the requirements to rent an apartment aren't set in stone and landlords can change them, certain property owners may decide to do this if they get an applicant they don't like. For example, it may no longer be legal to reject somebody who's got past criminal history, but it is legal to only accept people with 770 credit. But let's say a property owner actually went and did this. How would you find out and how would you catch them? There's a way, and landlords get caught doing this all the time. So that's a luxury building, and then over here, there's like an alleyway of container businesses. Anyways, if you want to live in this building, the way the law works now is that the landlord's going to have to give you a written explanation as to why. And they have to talk about why your criminal history prevents you from living there. And they also have to prove that it's within their legitimate business interest to keep you out of the property. And the reason they have to prove it is because applicants are allowed to appeal. Basically, if you end up getting rejected because of some sort of criminal history in your past, you have the opportunity to try and resolve the issue in the mind of the property owner. The law also absolves landlords of any crimes committed in their properties, which is kind of a big deal. At first, landlords were worried that if they rented to somebody with a criminal history and that person committed crimes in the property, they would get sued for not creating a safe place for people to live. But there are other things landlords have to tell you about if they reject you. For example, credit. If your credit's lousy and a landlord rejects you because of that, the United States' Fair Credit Reporting Act mandates they give you a written disclosure. And in New York City, they actually have to give you a copy of the report, which was used to deny your application. Also in New York, it's now illegal for owners to charge more than 20 bucks to check your credit, and they're also no longer allowed to charge application fees. Prior to 2019, it would be common to be hit with a $50 or a $100 fee just to apply for the opportunity of possibly renting something or possibly getting rejected. The real issue here is that some landlords are arbitrarily changing their requirements or just refusing to work with people who might now actually be protected from discrimination because of these new laws, and the city's got a new plan to catch landlords who do this. So the city's got a new program in place to catch apartment scofflaws, and the way they're gonna do it is through using testers. And when you think of the word tester, think of a secret shopper. That's what an apartment tester is. Now, the way that apartment testers catch landlords who are discriminating is pretty interesting. Now, we're gonna explain what apartment testers do and how they catch landlords, but first, it's important to know that although the state of New York has always relied on testers to help spot discrimination, a recent investigation that exposed housing bias in Long Island is why this program is such a big deal and why the state government is financing it. The investigation uncovered widespread housing bias by real estate professionals, which is completely illegal. And here's how these guys got caught. A nonprofit watchdog sent in testers who posed as renters to try to find out if landlords were discriminating. And the way testers operate is they essentially have one group go and look at an apartment who shouldn't be a victim of discrimination, and then they have a test group who could be a victim go and do the exact same thing. And in our example of criminal backgrounds, you could have somebody go and see an apartment who doesn't claim to have a criminal background, and shortly thereafter you could have somebody else try to see the exact same place, but they could claim that in their past they were convicted of something, and then they could see how the property owner reacts. Easiest way to do this is to call and schedule appointments over the phone. The next way to do this is to have actual in-person meetings, and the third way is to actually apply and submit paperwork and identifiable information to see if your application gets approved. Now again, just because someone does or doesn't get approved for an apartment does not necessarily indicate discrimination, and it also doesn't necessarily indicate that somebody broke the law. And that's why with these tests, the testers have to do it multiple times. They've got to call and see if they get the runaround, yes or no. Then they've got to go see the apartment in person and see if they still get the runaround. So it can be a very involved process. And what they're trying to do is establish a pattern of discrimination. For example, if every time prospective renters call the landlord of this particular property right here, and every time they say they've got a criminal background, he's just not available to show the place, while he's simultaneously available and eager to show the apartment to people who don't claim to have a criminal background, you might be onto something. So now the state government is overseeing a new $2.2 million program, and the program is going to fund nonprofit organizations and watchdog groups to train apartment testers. The money that they get for the program is going to be because of higher licensing and registration fees for brokers. But are these state programs actually going to catch landlords who are the bad guys? And does having a criminal record make someone a bad guy? And does everyone deserve a home no matter what? Let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.